A brief introduction on me for those of you that don't know me, which is probably most of you. So I spent most of my career in typical corporate jobs, most of it at the Procter & Gamble company for 20 years, a couple of years as a consultant for Accenture. But along that way, I just became fascinated with this concept of storytelling and ended up interviewing all of the leaders that I admired the most, who I thought were particularly good at it. And at this point, I think I'm up to 300 or so executives that I've had these one-on-one, face-to-face, 2-hour-long interviews about their use of storytelling. And these are leaders from all over the world, 25 countries around the world. And each of them has probably told me 8 to 10 to 12 different stories. So if you do the math, I've literally documented around 3,000 individual business leadership type stories. And that's, of course, allowed me to reverse engineer my way into what works in storytelling and what doesn't. But it's also given me a flavor for the incredible diversity of situations where storytelling can help someone at work and at home. And all of that research has led into the books that I've written on leadership storytelling, storytelling for sales and marketing, storytelling for you as a parent at home to teach your kids character and wisdom. So whether it's at work or at home, I've tried to focus on the many different ways storytelling can help us be successful in life. So let me move on to what my objectives are for the 30 minutes or so that I have with you today. And that is, the main thing is I want to introduce you to what I think are the 10 most important stories I think every leader should be able to tell. And that means in whatever line of work you're in, whether it's in business or politics or teaching or a nonprofit, if you have leadership responsibilities in that organization, there are dozens and dozens of types of stories I think that you could and should tell. And that's what I've spent in most of my other books documenting many of those. But what I want to do for you today is to narrow that list down to 10. The 10 most important stories I think every leader should be able to tell. And I'll share how I picked those 10. I'll give you an example of a few of them. I'll give you some tips for how to find your own story like that. I'm going to give you a minute or two to brainstorm which are the most important ones for you, because some will be more important to you than others. So what I'm not going to talk about today is how do you craft these stories or why storytelling works or anything else. You've had an entire week of this wonderful series that Artem has put on for you. And I'm sure all of those topics have been touched many times. So I just want to focus very narrowly on what are the most important stories to tell. And the reason I want to focus on that is because I honestly believe that that's the most important decision that a storyteller will ever make. What stories do I need to tell? And it's odd because most of the publishers and most of the articles that are written and what I spend most of my time doing, quite frankly, is teaching people how to craft those stories. What's the structure of the story and how do you create the right emotional engagement and how do you create a surprise ending and how long should they be and how many details should you include and how do you use dialogue? And those things are important, but I've come to believe that none of those things are nearly as important as choosing the right stories to tell. The story is more important than the delivery. And so this is the first and most important thing I think any leader needs to do, is to decide what stories they need to tell. And that's why I want to focus on that for my time with you today. So let me start then with how I picked these particular 10 stories out of all of these 10 types of stories. There are millions of individual stories, but there's a smaller number of types of stories. So how did I settle on these particular 10 out of the dozens of types of leadership stories that I could have chosen? Well, here's how. First of all, these are the 4 criteria that I used. First of all, stories that my clients repeatedly ask me for help with. So my clients are executives at companies all over the world, and they usually contact me asking me for help with a particular type of story or two. And so I wanted to start by choosing stories that I knew were very practically relevant to people in the working world, because leaders are asking for help with these types of stories. So that was my first criteria, stories that leaders are asking for help with. The second criteria was I wanted to pick stories in areas about which leaders should exert some influence in the organization and have a strong opinion. So just in my own, 30 years in the business world, you learn that some areas are important for leaders to influence and some areas are not. So that was my second filter, was I wanted these to be very important areas for leadership to exert influence on. All right, the third criteria, I wanted to pick stories that would be relevant to people in all job functions. So not just the CEO or the COO, not just the chief financial officer or the head of marketing or the head of sales or the chief engineer or the head of IT or engineering. I wanted to pick stories that I knew would be relevant to everybody throughout the organization. All right, all of the functions should be represented in these stories. And then fourth, I wanted to pick stories that I knew wouldn't need to change very often. All right, there are some stories that you can tell over and over and over again, and they're going to continue to be relevant. And some stories that you'll tell that you'll only need to tell once or twice or three times, and then that story never needs to be told again. So, for example, a vision story, a story about your vision for the future, that's going to be relevant for a long time. Your founding story, the story of the founding of your company, well, that should never change. Companies usually only get founded one time. So the point is, I wanted stories that you could invest the time to get the stories right, because you're going to tell them over and over and over again. So it would behoove you to invest some time and get them done and told properly. All right, so those are my four criteria. So using those four criteria and the literally thousands of stories that I've documented and the hundreds of different types of leadership stories that I've come across, these are the 10 that came to the top using those four criteria. All right. And I'll start with the first four, because the first four go together because they're about setting the direction for the organization. So that's where we came from. That's a founding story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, right? Because a strategy is about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So imagine you can tell those four stories to your audience, the people you work with. You're much more likely to get them to go where you want them to go and accomplish what you want them to accomplish, because you can easily articulate and compellingly articulate through a compelling story where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there, right? The key pillars of direction setting for leadership. All right. So the next four go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So those four are what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about your customer that will help your organization understand the customer on a personal, human, visceral level. Ultimately, the boss you're all working for. All right, 7 is what we do for our customers. So I call that a classical sales story, a story about what you do that's so awesome that people should pay you money to go do it. And then number 8, how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story, because marketing is about differentiating you from your competitors. All right, but the last two go together as well, but they're more about you personally, the leader. All right, number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. Right, so that's a recruiting story. So you, the person you're talking to, right, not you. And I include those because I think every leader's job is attracting talented people into the organization and getting them to stay and follow your leadership. So if you notice throughout those 10, there's a little bit of something for everybody. Yeah, there's a sales story. There's a marketing story. And certainly the sales and marketing people will need to tell those stories. But sales and marketing people will need to tell dozens of sales and marketing stories. But even if you work in IT or HR or engineering, you need to be able to tell one good sales story and one good marketing story. And the rest of them, I think, are just highly relevant to everybody, no matter what function they work in. So those are the 10. What I want to do is give you an example of a handful of them and give you some tips for finding those stories for yourself. And then we'll do a little exercise where you get to pick what are the most important ones for you. All right. So, in fact, let's do that right now. Actually, I'm not even sure if we have anybody watching live, so we may not be able to do this. But if you're watching, whether you're watching live or recorded, I want you to take the next 60 seconds, look at this list, and pick 3 to 5 of these 10 that are the most important for you personally to go develop. All right. This is going to become your wish list of stories that you wish you had. All right. So begin. Okay. All right. So let's move on. What I want to do is give you an example of 3 or 4 or 5 of these to give you a real flavor for what these stories look like when done well. I won't have time to give you an example of all 10, but I will give you an example of a few. And we might have time for you as a group to pick the ones that are most important for you that I haven't shared yet. So the one I want to start with is number 9, a why I lead the way I do story. So I call this a leadership philosophy story, personal leadership philosophy. So this is a story that you would tell to your organization to help them understand how you've become the kind of leader you are, the kind of leadership to expect from you, and the kind of leadership you expect from them. All right. So this particular example is about a guy named Mike. And Mike's first job out of college was in the Army, in the military. So his first leadership opportunity was actually in a training exercise. And he was assigned to be the leader of a tank, the one you see in the picture here, and that's him in the center there, sitting closest to the camera. So his first exercise, again, it was just a training exercise on a 10-mile long, 5-mile wide training field with real tanks. There were 400 tanks on one side of the field and 400 tanks on the other side of the field. And they were going to go into battle against each other, a simulated battle. So it was basically like a giant game of laser tag, but with real tanks, right? So that nobody would get hurt, but they could learn the strategies of battle. And Mike happened to be assigned to be the leader of the first tank that was going to go into battle on his side of the field with 399 other tanks behind him. All right. I'm going to pull the slide off so that you can maybe focus a little bit. Again, he was assigned to be in charge of that first tank. So, of course, the night before the exercise, he sits down with his commanding officer. They pull out a map of the terrain. They figure out where the high ground is so that he'll have the best chance of winning the exercise. The next morning, the exercise starts. The tanks start racing out onto the field. Mike is in the first tank. He gets a mile or so into the field, and he has to make his first decision. Does he turn right or turn left? And he can't remember what to do. So he has a decision to make. He can either stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, figure out the right thing to do, which might take, 30 seconds, or he can just guess. Well, Mike chose option 2. He yelled out, "Driver, turn left." So the driver turned left. Right? Well, within a minute or so, the light inside of his tank started flashing, which means you just got shot by a laser. You're dead. So they had to stop the tank, pop the hatch, get out. Those guys are done for the day. Well, of course, a few seconds later, the second tank turns left right behind him because that's their job. Follow the leader. Well, within a few seconds, their light starts flashing. They got shot by a laser. They're done. A few seconds later, tank number 3 turns left. Their light starts flashing. They're done. But tank number 4, the people in tank number 4 saw 3 tanks turn left and get shot and killed. They realized that was a mistake. So the tank number 4 turned right. And then 396 other tanks turned right. They took the high ground and won the exercise. Now, Mike learned an important lesson that day, and that is this, that sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than make the right decision slowly, right? Just imagine what would have happened if he had stopped the tank and turned the light on to figure out the right thing to do. There would have been 399 or 400 tanks lined up, stopped, sitting ducks, waiting for him to make a decision. They all would have been shot. But the fact that he made a decision quickly allowed them to figure out the right thing to do. Because, war and business and work and life are all similar in that when you make a bad decision, life has a way of letting you know pretty quickly. Things start to go badly and you realize that was a mistake and you can monitor and adjust and go in a different direction. So Mike made a mistake that day. He turned left instead of right, but he learned a valuable lesson from it. And to this day, he's a much more decisive leader. He makes quick decisions, but he's also very forgiving of people if they make a decision that's wrong, as long as they learn from that decision. So people know if they need a quick decision to go to Mike. And they also know what kind of leadership he expects from them. So that's an example of a leadership philosophy story, a story that explains how Mike has become the leader that he is today, what experiences shaped his leadership style and that he expects from other people. Now, he could just tell people, look, I'm very decisive as a leader. Well, maybe, but the story helps them understand really, no, I mean, I'm really a decisive leader, and why he's a decisive leader, and maybe why it's wise to be a decisive leader. So that's one example. So if you're interested in creating story number 9 for yourself, obviously you can't use that story. You need your own story. So here are some things that you should do to find your own leadership philosophy story. Ask yourself these 4 questions. First of all, what's the biggest leadership mistake I've ever made? Right? Secondly, what leadership decision are you the most proud of? Third, what leader do you most admire, and what was the moment you realized you admired them? And 4, what 1 or 2 principles are you least willing to sacrifice to achieve your goals, and why? So think of those 4 questions, answer them for yourself, and then pick whatever the most interesting and insightful idea that came to mind when you thought of those 4 questions, and build a story around it. And that will be one of your leadership philosophy stories. Like for Mike, it was that first question. What was one of his biggest leadership mistakes? Well, it was his first leadership mistake, right? So maybe that's a 5th question. What's your first leadership mistake? But finding your mistakes is a good way to find your own leadership philosophy stories. Okay, let's move on to a second story. This would be, I picked number 5 for this one, a corporate values story. So, and this story is about a man named Sam Walton, whose name many of you will be familiar with. He's the founder of Walmart, which is one of the largest retail stores in the world, and maybe the largest. When Walmart was still fairly new, there was another store in the United States, in the state of Texas, that was bigger than Walmart. It was called HEB. And at some point, Walmart was growing and HEB was declining. And at some point in the mid-1980s, Walmart became a bigger store than HEB. The CEO of HEB called Sam Walton on the phone, the CEO of Walmart, and he said these 2 things. He said, first of all, congratulations, you're now the largest retailer in the state of Texas. My company used to be. Secondly, I'd love to know how you did it. I'd love to bring my leadership team to your headquarters just on a learning mission. You're obviously doing something right, and we'd love to learn from you. Now, Sam Walton could have been, forgiven for just saying, no, you're my competitor. I'm not going to teach you anything. But he didn't. What he said was, well, I don't know what I could teach you, but I'll be happy to try. So they made an appointment for all of those leaders to fly to his headquarters and meet him at a local Walmart store. Well, on the appointed day, at the appointed hour, all of these leaders came into the store in suits and ties and walking around looking for Sam Walton, this multi-billionaire, head of this, world's largest retailer. And they saw him at the end of one of the grocery aisles. And so they started walking up the aisle. And when Sam saw them coming up, he stopped them and said to the CEO, Charles, hold on a minute. I'm helping this young woman. I'll be with you in a minute. He was talking to a customer, and he was trying to sell her an ironing board cover, a little $5 item, an ironing board cover. And he kept showing her the different patterns and different price ranges, and until eventually she decided on one and put it in her buggy and shoved off to the register. He then turned around to Charles, the CEO of the other company, and all of his executives and said, Charles, do you know how many worn out ironing board covers there are in this country? We're going to sell 1 million of them this month. Now, what can I tell you about retail? Now, and that's the end of the story. And I want you to imagine if you were a new hire at Walmart and somebody was trying to teach you about the values and culture at Walmart. And instead of giving you a list, they simply told you that story. what kind of values would you have learned from that story? And I've got some listed on the screen here, and you probably have already thought of these yourself, but things like, you know what? Other retailers are competitors, not our enemies. If we can help them serve the same customers better without giving away our trade secrets, we probably should. The second one, there's probably the most important one. The customer is number one, right? Sam Walton made all those executives wait while he took care of a customer, even though they had an appointment with him. All those executives had an appointment with him at that place in that time, but he made them wait while he took care of a customer. The customer is number one. Number three, the importance of understanding the customer's wants and needs. How did Sam Walton know there were so many worn out ironing board covers in the country? He asked, right? Also, you see him being persistent and not giving up until she made a decision. You see the passion for winning. Like, he was excited about selling 1 million ironing board covers this month. This multi-billionaire who, sells all kinds of items, and he's excited about selling ironing board covers, right? The passion is contagious. And there are probably a dozen other values you can see in that story. The point is, the story does a much better job of communicating the company values than the list of company stories that's probably in the company value statement that's probably in a file drawer somewhere that nobody will ever see, right? So that's an example of a corporate value story. All right, so to find your own corporate value stories, do this. First of all, find that company value statement, all right? Go through each item on the list and ask yourself, when have I seen somebody behave exactly like this in a way that exemplifies this value? And when have I seen somebody behave in the opposite character? Somebody who did not behave this way and suffered the consequences, right? In one of those, you're going to find a good corporate values story. Build a story around that situation, or as many of those situations as you can find, and you'll have lots of corporate value stories. All right, I think we have time for one more example, and then I'll take some questions. And I chose number 8 here, how we're different from our competitors. So I call that a marketing story. You don't have to be selling a product or service necessarily to use this. No matter what you're doing for the people who you work with and for, there are probably other people, other companies that do the same thing. Part of your job is to differentiate yourself from them. And the best way to do that is with a story. And so my favorite example here comes from a guy named Sherrod Madison, who is the CEO of United Building Maintenance. It's a commercial cleaning company. They go into buildings and clean them at night. And when he has a call on a prospective new customer, he always brings his sales manager and they have a sales pitch they go through. But he almost always tells them a story about what he does when he gets a new customer. He says, I always sneak into the building in the middle of the night and see how they're cleaning it now. Now, it's probably a little bit less nefarious than I just made it sound because he gets permission to go do this. But what he does is he goes in to see how they're cleaning it today, because at the end of the month, when his company takes over, he's going to inherit those employees, their contract employees. And he wants to know if they're properly trained and have the right equipment. So he said, for example, last month we took over the Verizon building in New Jersey. And I went into the building at 2:00 in the morning and I found a guy vacuuming the carpets. And he was using the same kind of walk behind push vacuum cleaner that I use at home, just a residential quality vacuum cleaner. Now, those floors are 12 feet wide and a half a mile around. It's going to take that guy a month just to vacuum the carpets once with that machine. And by the way, it's going to break down every few weeks because it's not made for that kind of volume. When we took over, we put him into a triple wide industrial grade vacuum cleaner that'll do the job in a fraction of the time, do a much better quality job, and that thing is going to last forever, right? So then we went to another floor. I found a guy shampooing the carpets, and it's kind of the same thing. He was using the same kind of walk behind squeeze bottle shampooer that I use at home. So when we took over, we put him into one of those commercial grade riding shampooers, right? That'll do a much better job, much faster. And notice it gets the guy off his feet. Now he's sitting down to work. So I have fewer injuries at work now. Well, the last thing I wanted to do was to go see how they were cleaning the tops of the cabinets. And that's where this picture might help. I went and looked at the top of all of the cabinets in the offices, and I noticed a half a moon swiped out on the top of all of them. And I know exactly what that means, and you probably do too. He said, most of the people doing the cleaning, those cabinets are 5.5 feet tall. Most of the people cleaning them were shorter than that. So it wasn't that they were lazy. They just couldn't reach all the way to the back of the tall cabinet to clean it well. And that's what leaves the half a moon swiped out on top. And he said the truth is they'd be better off not cleaning it at all, because it's the contrast between the dusty part and the clean part that makes it obvious it's not been cleaned properly. So when we took over, we just gave them all these little 18-inch plastic extension wands for them to reach all the way to the back. Problem solved. Now, he tells that story instead of saying something like this. Well, the reason why we're better than our competitors is we use triple wide industrial grade vacuuming machines. We use riding commercial grade shampooers. And I give all my dusters 18-inch extension wands to reach all the way to the back. And that's why we're different. I mean, those are true. Those are three very legitimate, logical reasons why his company's different. But when you've heard the story, you can see in your mind's eye, that guy riding around on that shampooing machine like a go-kart, right? Or the Zamboni driver at the ice skating rink. You can see that person easily reaching the back with their dust cloth. It leaves a visual impression that's much more compelling than just the list of reasons why his company's better. So I'll tell you how to find this story, and then I'll stop and take some questions. To find your own marketing story, do at least three of these things. Talk to some of your customers who use your competitors' products, but have switched. They used to use your competitors' products, but they switched to using yours. Why did they switch? And find out what was their experience with the other product and their experience with yours. Think of some of the most positive customer success stories at your company about using your product. And then thirdly, think of a time when you or someone else used to use your competitors' products and had a bad experience. All three of those are going to give you fodder for a good marketing story, a good how you're different from your competitor's story. All right, so I think I'm out of time here. Let me skip to the end and just ask if, Artem, do we have time for any questions, or do we need to move on?
Of course we have. We have at least 5 minutes for it. And Paul, what a great way to envision these stories and bring them to life. Thank you so much. If you have any, Paul, please feel free to write them into the chat, and I'll just drop some links to connect. To be honest, I've read some of them, these stories in your books. First in Lead with the Story, then in the second one you're talking to us today about. Still, you make them so live. I mean, they're so full of energy. Thank you for that. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, storytelling should be fun. Yeah, if it's not, you're not doing it right.
Exactly. Let me ask you this question before we wait for the people to write something. You're telling that these stories, like, they don't grow old as often as they used to, but maybe some piece of advice of how to feel that the story is growing older, even like this kind of great story.
Yeah, so I think judging your audience's reaction, right? If you're, starting to tell a story and people start to roll their eyes or look at their watch, or, that's always an indication that, I've heard this story before. Maybe you need some new content. So I think those are pretty obvious cues. If another one is, if you get bored telling it, that's an indication that you need something different about it. But I tell you, one way I avoid that is I don't memorize the stories and tell them word for word. I just remember the basic outline of the story, the structure of the story, the gist of the story. And then every time you tell it, it'll be a little bit different. And that keeps it, at least for me, the storyteller, a little bit fresh and different, so that I don't get bored telling it. That's one of my tricks.
Good. Great trick. Gonna use it. Kimberly says there that you had a good job there. Yeah.
That's a familiar name. Excellent. Good. It's always good to see a familiar name in these things. Yeah, so one of the other things to answer that question, Artem, though, is you should be getting new stories. Like, yes, you need a corporate value story, but you probably should have several of them and rotate through them. Your founding story, yeah, that's just not going to change. Your vision story should change as often as your vision changes. So if you get a new vision every 5 years, you probably need a new vision story every 5 years. But some of those, you could get new ones. You don't have to tell the same one over and over again. So that's another way to keep them fresh.
Good. Understood. Perfect. Mary Alice, our previous speaker, wants to know, where do you see the leading edge in leadership stories now? Such a good question.
I think I would say in the breadth of the stories they tell, as opposed to the depth. Like, I think what I said at the beginning is, in my opinion, the stories, what story you tell is more important than how you tell it. So I think leaders can always get a little bit better at their delivery of stories. But I think where there's a lot of room for improvement, where people can really increase their leadership impact, is by telling lots of different types of leadership stories. When I work with an executive, their eyes get the biggest when I give them examples of lots of different types of stories. They go, "Oh, I had no idea I needed a strategy story. I've got a strategy. I didn't know I needed a strategy story to go with it. I've got a vision. I didn't know I need a vision story to go with it." Right. So I think getting them to tell stories in more leadership challenges is really where leaders are going to distinguish themselves in the use of storytelling.
Mm, good. So the applicability of the stories. Good. Thank you.
Mhm.
We have one more coming in from Joanna. She wants to know, like, should the stories be created by top leadership only or also by employees, and maybe the difference for the types?
Yeah, I think everybody can use stories. Sometimes I'm hesitant to use the word leaders because it makes people think of only the executives can tell these stories. No, anybody who wants to influence other people at work can use stories very effectively. So even if you don't have anybody that reports to you, you're not the boss of anybody. You're an individual contributor at the bottom of the hierarchy. If you want to influence people, storytelling can help. And some of these same stories can help you influence. You might be influencing up or sideways, even if you're not influencing down. So yeah, I should probably use the word influencers more often than I use leaders.
Yeah, but the leaders is like, well, storyfy your leadership. We didn't call it storyfy your influencers. So
Yeah.
it's definitely
Yeah, I see David. David's one of my heroes as well, as asking, how about leaders listening to others' stories instead of telling their own? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I tell my clients the majority of stories you tell should be about other people. They should be other people's stories that you've heard and you like, and then you're retelling it. And you're telling it. You're not stealing it. You're not saying this happened to me, because that would be a lie. You're just, I'm going to tell a story about Artem, or I'm going to tell a story about David, because I've heard him tell that story, and it's very effective, and it'll be just as effective when I tell you his story. So yeah, the leaders that only tell stories about themselves come across as arrogant, self-centered leaders, and nobody wants to work for those leaders. Most of the stories you tell should be about other people, and the stories that you do tell about yourself, most of them should be your failure stories, mistakes that you made that other people can learn from so that they don't make the same mistakes you made. And then a small number of stories you tell about yourself should be where you're kind of the hero and did something right. It's okay to tell those every once in a while, but that shouldn't be the majority of what you tell.
Thank you. And David also enjoyed this answer, I guess. Paul, that was awesome. Thank you so much for sharing these ideas and the great questions. If any more come up, just feel free to write them into the chat. We will have some sort of a review of the conference in a minute. And I just want to ask you one last question. I've asked it
Mhm.
33 times now. This is going to be 34th.
Uh-oh.
So, what if a story came to life and was about to teach leaders one thing and one thing only? That one thing would be.
What if a story came to life and could teach leaders one thing and one thing only? What would it be?
Yes.
Well, how many times have you had somebody say, teach them how to be better storytellers? Is that taken already? Can I use
You
that
can
one?
use whatever you want to, even if it's taken.
Yeah, that's the most obvious one. So I'll stick with that one. Sorry, I didn't have a more creative one for you. I should have listened to the other answers.
That's all right. So, how to be better at storytelling?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Paul. That was great, and what a great adage and a great energetic boost at the end. Let's all give our fire to Paul, and I'll just drop some contacts once again. And thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to have been a part of this.